Alright, today we're going to talk about some of my 16-bit memories. Now, back in the Atari and NES era, I never had my own game system, so I always had to rely on friends or the arcade if I wanted to play any games. And it was pretty much the same when the 16-bit generation started off. And my buddy Bill, he introduced me to this guy Rick. And, we were both guitar players, we both loved thrash metal. We also listened to stuff like Joe Satriani and Primus, so we got along really well right away. And then I found out he was a gamer. Now, keep in mind that things were a lot different back then. Back then, usually, if you had a game system, you had one game system, and if you were really lucky, you had a Game Boy. It's not like nowadays where, I have a PS3 and a PS4 and a 360 and a Wii U and a 3DS and gaming PC and a smartphone and a tablet. So I was pretty shocked when I walked into his house and discovered all the stuff that he had. So when you walk in, right away he's got a top-of-the-line gaming PC. And, by today's standards it'd be a joke, but, back then it was... He could play all the latest and greatest games. And then we go into his bedroom and he's got a TurboGrafx, a Super Nintendo, and a Sega Genesis, and also a Game Boy. And later on, he would add the Sega CD, and then the Neo Geo, which he put on a TV out in the living room, a big, 27-inch wooden box that they used to have back then. So we had, just lots of great gaming memories in there. Two-player games, one-player games, everything. Now, he didn't have a lot of games. He did a lot of renting, actually. But I remember on the TurboGrafx, he did have two games. And one of them being Alex Kidd, which it didn't really do it for me back then. But the other game he had was one that I really loved, and that was called Neutopia. Now, if you've never played Neutopia, it is pretty much a copy of The Legend of Zelda. And what's funny about that is I played Zelda on the NES, and I hated it. I thought it was one of the most boring things I'd ever played. But for whatever reason, I loved Neutopia on the TurboGrafx, and it was pretty much an exact copy of the game, just with, different character names and enemy names and all that. But yeah, really fun adventure. I never beat it back then. It was only until years later that I would beat it on the Magic Engine emulator on the PC. And then he also had the Sega Genesis. Of course, he had, Sonics 1, 2, and 3, and those were so much fun. So different than, the Mario games, because the Mario games, you could run through them, but they weren't really about running through them. The Sonic games were just so fast, and you could just tear through levels, and, I remember, the first level in Sonic 1, you can beat it in, 30 seconds or something ridiculous. And then, we played all sorts of other games like X-Men, X-Men 2. Really loved X-Men 2. That was the weird one where you don't have a title screen, you just get thrown into level 1 with a random character, and you're like, what the hell? And then after you beat that short level, you get, your character select screen and everything. Another game we really enjoyed was Streets of Rage, which was a classic beat-em-up. So much fun just beating up enemies. It was kind of challenging, but I enjoyed the hell out of it, and it's really fun as a two-player game too. Now, the Sega CD, he had 3 games for it, and I really didn't care for him at all. The games he got were Sherlock Holmes, which I played for an hour and I got stuck and I just could never advance. Then he also had Willy Beamish, which I just thought was boring. Why can't I move my character? Why am I only moving a cursor around the screen? I just didn't get it back then. And then he had Sewer Shark, which I believe was packed in with the system. And that game, I found that game kind of fun. That was the only Sega CD game I've ever beaten, actually. If I played it now, I probably would not like it, but it was fun back in the day. And then there was the Super Nintendo. And I loved that system. I loved the controller, just everything about it. I didn't really care for the big purple buttons and everything, but what can you do? But the one game he did have for that was Super Mario World, and that was really fun. I played through that game so many times, probably like 25 times at his house. And, you know, it was a lot easier than Mario 3. I still haven't beaten Mario 3. It's a really hard game in my opinion. But Super Mario World was considerably easier, and you could rack up 99 lives within like a half hour. But even though it was really easy, it was still really fun. Just a really well-designed game. Lots of secrets. I love it to this day. And then I remember one of the first games he rented was ActRaiser, and that was published by Enix back when Square and Enix were two separate companies. And I had never seen anything like that before, and I really haven't seen anything like it since, with the exception of Dark Cloud. You know, you start off and it kind of looks like a Ghouls and Ghosts kind of game, but a hell of a lot easier. But you know, after you beat that stage, you go to this overworld and you're playing God and you're directing the people, you know, how to build their village, and you're burning down bushes and, you know, sending rain and stuff, and just like all sorts of really cool stuff. And you know, I never played the sequel, ActRaiser 2. I heard it wasn't quite as good. They made it more of an action game. But I loved that first ActRaiser game. And the soundtrack, which I didn't realize until about a year ago, was actually done by the Ys composer. And there are some great music tracks in that game. Really nice graphics. Just one of my favorites on the Super Nintendo. And then another game I remember him renting that just blew me away was Super Castlevania 4. And, you know, I played the original Castlevania on NES, and even though it was frustratingly hard, I loved it. It was just so dark. It was so different than any other game I had played, and it was just well designed too, even though it was really difficult. It never felt cheap to me. And then when Super Castlevania 4 came out, the game was considerably easier, but I still thought it was hard back then. But yeah, the graphics were just upgraded so much, and they were gorgeous. And then the music was just so like dark, and it really set the mood for the game. And yeah, and the levels were crazy. Like, you get to level 4, and there's that thing where the map's kind of turning behind you, and then there's that one stage where you have to hang, and the whole level like turns like this. And so much fun had with that game. I never beat that one back in the day, but I did eventually beat it later on. Shortly after that, I started seeing this girl, Sarah, and she introduced me to this game called Toe Jam and Earl on the Genesis. And this was another game that was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was this weird adventure game where you're kind of exploring these worlds, looking for parts of your missing spaceship. But it had these weird, like, mystery presents that you open for various power-ups, and then you have, like, negative ones, like rain clouds and stuff. And it had really wacky enemy designs, and it was really funny, and just a lot of fun, and it was really cool because it had, you know, a random world, so you could get a different gameplay experience every time you played. And then finally, I got my lazy ass up and got myself a job at the grocery store right across the street from me, and with my first paycheck, bought myself a Genesis. And you know, I was kind of debating between Super Nintendo and Genesis. The main reason I went with Genesis was because not only of Sonic and Toe Jam and Earl, but the big thing back then was sports games. And, you know, a lot of people laugh about sports games nowadays, but back then they were a huge deal, and if you wanted sports games, you got yourself a Genesis because they were always better on there. And big one for me was Madden 93. You know, again, it's primitive by today's standards. They didn't have player names or anything, and you couldn't play like a season or a franchise. You just had a playoff mode to go through. But yeah, just a lot of fun. Really well-designed football game. It was pretty much the most in-depth thing at the time, because before, you know, you had like more arcadey games like Tecmo Bowl, which was cool, but, you know, you only had like a handful of plays to select from with that. And I think it was like 7 players on each team or something. It's been a while. And then, you had like your Atari football, which was atrocious. Yeah, but the Madden games were really something back then, and a lot of hours were spent on that one. And then another one I also played was NHL PA 93, which is a very fun hockey game, and I actually still enjoy that one to this day. Even though I don't watch hockey, I have no interest in watching it. It's just a really fun game to play. It's cool, you could get in fights and stuff, and if you win the fight, your enemy falls back and his head cracks open, then there's pixelated blood on the ice. Just a good time with that game. Another game I bought for my Genesis back then was Desert Strike by Electronic Arts. And it was a very challenging game, but it was really cool, flying your helicopter around, trying to rescue people, trying not to run out of gas or ammo, while trying to avoid enemy fire at the same time. I never made it past level 2 in that, but it's still a highly enjoyable game. Another game I really enjoyed was Chakan the Forever Man. And I remember seeing it in the game store, and it just had such a cool looking cover. There was no way I was leaving the game store without that game. And it was a pretty badass game. It was frustratingly hard, but it was just really cool. I loved the little story that they had with it, and the character just looked really cool. Really cool gameplay mechanics with the spin sword attack and everything, and how you had to use alchemy and stuff. Just another game that I really loved back then. And the Genesis is actually the system that introduced me to RPGs, and the one I played for it was called Sword of Vermilion. Now, the term RPG hadn't actually entered my gaming vocabulary yet. I just thought it was a cool, adventure game. But it was really neat because you had like these 3D dungeons you would walk through, and then when you got into combat, it would switch to an overhead view, and you'd basically just like, hack with your sword or, use your magic to defeat enemies. So it was a really cool, unique game. I never did manage to beat it. I got stuck like halfway through and I put it down. But really enjoyable game. Alright, so that'll do it for my 16-bit memories. If you guys have any memories, please share them down below in the comment section or make a video response. And I want to thank you guys very much for watching, and stay awesome.